Bieter's. Go ahead.
I'm John Bieter. I'm an assistant professor of history at Boise State University, and we're at California State University, Bakersfield, at the Mugaz Gaindi conference. And I just want to tell you a little bit about my presentation. It's actually some work of kind of bringing together two ideas. So it's some previous work that I had done based on Marcus Lee Hansen's application of a third generation return. And his idea is that immigrant groups go through these phases, that the first generation scratches out a living, takes advantage of the opportunities that are there in the new setting, that the second generation grows up in kind of what we describe as a hyphenated identity, which is really ethnic at home and American or the host country outside of it. And that by the time the third generation comes, there's this return back, a renewal or resurgence to go back to the Basque country that ironically they've settled enough in this case in America that there's a desire to go back. And so that's really formed the basis of a lot of my research that I've done with the Basque. It's like any theory, it never fits everybody, but seems to have been pretty consistent with the Basque American experience. And I think just one other point to make on it is that it parallels very well where the larger American culture was going. And what I mean by that is the earliest Basque immigrants, that largest group that came over, were part of a massive movement of immigration that really began to change in 1924 with the changing of legislation, and in 1934 with the Taylor Grazing Act that altered the sheep industry so much. And then you have maybe two wars that are so different. So World War II, which was such an Americanizing event, at a time when that second generation was particularly making its way into American culture. And so the waves of assimilation and the larger American waves of Americanization really began to come together. And then by the time that the third generation comes about and begins to look for different kinds of things, you have the 60s, which was a tremendously tumultuous time in America generally. And then you have a conflict like the Vietnam War, which seemed to push people to search for deeper meanings and to deconstruct accepted attitudes of what American identity was in general. So it fits it so well. It seemed that model fit pretty well. And what I'm going to do today is to take that work that I've done and put it alongside work by Thomas Friedman, and he's probably the most well-known, the most publicly well-known, this notion that the world is flat, that the technology that we have now, the ease of communication, the ease of transportation, is changing so much that I'm going to argue that the Pyrenees, which have been the buffer for the Basque for so long, in some ways have been flattened, in the sense that this will be accessible to anybody in the Basque Country immediately. We're having a consortium here with people from all over the world. It's 2 or 3 days they'll be going back. That the whole notion of immigration and the vast distances that those earlier immigrants felt has just shrunk so immensely that it's collapsed in many ways the generational theory. I think, I'm going to argue anyway, it's still very early to tell, but it's just kind of collapsed or truncated all of those differences. So the new director that we have at Boise State University, Alberto Santana, director of the Basque Studies program, talks most every day with his mother from the Basque Country through this Skype, through this video technology. So my grandfather, it took him about 6 or 8 weeks to have an exchange of letter with his father, and then for it to get to Idaho. So 6 or 8 weeks versus instantaneous is a massive difference. So in many ways, I think I'm going to argue that the immigrants that first came over likely had more in common with those of the Middle Ages, and I don't mean that any kind of slam to them, but more of a peasant background that maybe was looking back, versus if they lived through most of the 20th century. One woman I interviewed, Asuncion de Sorsa, Chani Sorsa's grandmother, born in 1900, died in 1995. I would argue that she straddled far more than 95 years, that she may have straddled about 400 or 500 years in the world views that dominated it, but that kind of formed her, and that were around by the end of her life. So it's a meshing of those two things, and to see what happens with Basque identity and see what happens in the formation of all of this, as you may know, you may have more in common with somebody from Argentina and be more in contact with them than you were with your neighbor who lives right next door. So communities and networks and all of this is really getting reconfigured, and transportation and technology broadly, and communication in particular, are changing all of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John.